All right, I'm Mac Nichols, the chairman of the board for the Mannkal Economic Education Foundation. And I'd like to take you on a brief journey this evening, a celebration of sorts, for our excellent young leaders that have got through our program. Yet our various ill-worded 18 different free trade agreements protect our other countries' IP and knowledge, but forget ours. The days of open international knowledge sharing are clearly gone. Where is our Senate Committee on IP knowledge? Our competitors have had this level of scrutiny for decades. Our IP and knowledge laws are all circa 1970 to 2000. If we are to be free and prosperous nation in the coming decades, we must catch up and strengthen our controls and subsequent wealth from our ideas. It turns out now we are learning that ideas really do matter. And we have to take certain in the fields of freedom and individual responsibility, supported by our knowledge and IP. So let me just recap that. It turns out that ideas do matter in the fields of freedom and individual responsibility, supported by our knowledge and our IP. And this is partly why we've taken structural and relationship steps at Mannkal to create an enterprise hub for our young leaders going forwards. The IPA, SGS, HR Nichols, and Mannkal have enjoyed a strong and long-standing friendship for many decades. Speaking specifically on the IPA, they recently launched Ron's latest book in Melbourne. We're thrilled to see this partnership entering an exciting new phase for our enterprise hub here in Perth. I'd like to take this time now to introduce Jeanette here, Jeanette Hazelby, who's currently volunteering as our hub scholarship consultant. Welcome, Jeanette. On the IPA side, there's a natural synergy between the IPA's Generational Liberty, the IPA's Youth Membership Wing, and the work that our hub does for young people in WA on economic education. And we'll be working more closely together in the future. That's why I'd like to note that tonight, all eligible young attendees will receive a complimentary membership. Next, I'd like to introduce Ron Manners, and he's going to speak as part of our celebration, acknowledging the hard work of these young men and women as they launch into the next stage of their lives as leaders in thoughtful and careful delivery.
But first, this is big federal budget week. I can't resist making a comment about the federal budget. Everyone is making a comment, but this is easy. The federal budget reminds me of my adolescent days, my youth. And on my bedroom walls, I had all sorts of posters. Some were pages from the Playboy magazine. Some were photos of fast cars. And in one particular poster I clearly remember, around budget time, I remember this one was a poster that came from the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce. And it was titled, "Living at the government expense is very expensive." And it had the figures showing that the efficiency of governments is generally about 12.5%, which indicated that for every dollar the government spends, it has to raise 8. So the budget comes along and Prime Minister Albo announces that we are all of us will get $150. But he says that doesn't matter because it's only totaled up, it only adds up to 1.8 billion. So forget about it, it's not really expensive. But when you factor in and multiply that by 8, it comes out at $14.4 billion. Now, if we had an honest government, it would simply tax us to raise that extra $14.4 billion But it doesn't do that. It sneakily rolls it into a larger debt and rolls it over and leaves it to the next generation, which is the generation of our Mannkal scholars. So I think that's absolutely disgusting. So that's there endeth my comments on the federal budget. Thank you. I'm constantly amazed at our Mannkal scholars, and many of them are constantly in touch with us, telling us their exploits and what they're doing around the world, and it's very encouraging. It encourages us to just keep going. And as Jenny says to me, people shouldn't encourage you. You're incorrigible as you are, so don't encourage him. So here we are. Now, my real pleasure tonight is to welcome our noted guest speaker, Professor Geoffrey Blainey. He's well known, of course, as Australia's greatest historian. And an equal welcome also goes to Anne Blainey, who's travelled from Melbourne. And Geoffrey, you celebrated your 95th birthday last week, and this is part of the winding down from the birthday celebration. It's like a side trip to Perth. So thank you for making the distance. It's fantastic. The Wikipedia page describes Geoffrey Blainey as Australia's living treasure, and that if anyone wants to find out about Professor Geoffrey Blainey, the internet is the place to go. It's an outstanding story. So tonight, I would like to tell you, just might take 2 or 3 minutes to explain how we first met. I'm not sure whether Geoffrey remembers how we first met, but it was very significant to me. Now, we're going to go back to 1992, when I was at that time running a gold mining company out of Kalgoorlie. And we were in joint venture with another company called Elton Limited at that time. 50-50 joint venture, as you know, they're sometimes difficult, but this was a good one. We'd had some exploration discovery, and we decided to open an underground mine in Coolgardie. There hadn't been an underground mine opened in Coolgardie for 100 years. So we said, that's a very significant event. Let's have a mine opening. And then the discussion was, who should open the mine? With a 50-50 partnership, there's nobody in control. It comes out of this dreadful thing called democracy. So Graham Smith was the chairman of Elton, and I was the chairman of Croesus, so we looked at each other and we said, the way to settle this is each of us write on a piece of paper who we would like to open our mine. And then we fold the piece of paper and we put it in a hat. And we bring in the most attractive girl in the office we ask an independent person to come and pluck from the hat a folded piece of paper, which happened. They unfolded the paper and read loudly that Professor Geoffrey Blainey should be invited. We both cheered. It was mysterious. And we pulled out the other piece of paper and it said, Professor Geoffrey Blainey. Unbelievable. We both had come to the same conclusion. And what a great investment that trip was for us to have you visit us on the day. I think I've got a shot here. There we are. We toured the underground workings. Geoffrey and Anne, we toured it just to get a feel for the underground mine. I think, Geoffrey, on that day you were the best dressed guy underground, and certainly, Anne, you may have been the first woman ever to go underground in Coolgardie. there's only been 2 women before you. So that's an amazing, if I can work this thing, there we are. So after the underground tour, we came out and Geoffrey pulled the shroud off this wonderful bronze plaque that we'd had there. And there's Graham Smith on the left, I'm lurking in the background there. And we were gathered around the plaque to celebrate the event. Following that, we all went to the Denver City Hotel in the main street of Coolgardie and celebrated. And Geoffrey gave a wonderful, stirring address to all those assembled, to their astonishment. And as one of the miners left, he grasped me by the shoulder and he said, "Ron, nobody has ever told me the significance of what I'm doing to the national economy." That's the first time he realised what he was doing as an underground miner had repercussions, and there was a flow on. He was part of the productive Australia that saved us from going bankrupt. The lesson I learnt that day was these people that are productive, we must tell them. Each of us have a role to create a civil society, a productive and a prosperous society, to create something that's really worthwhile. So that's the message I learnt, and we're still putting it into practice. Thank you. That was a great investment to have us there on the day. Now, having given you a bit of a sidetrack there, I'll now hand over to Professor Geoffrey Blainey. Thank you.
I remember, Ron, the happy day we went underground at Coolgardie. The mine was called Mystery Mint, wasn't it? Mystery Mint. And after the mine had been opened, to my astonishment, Ron said, "Come to the Denver City Hotel, where the bar will be full, and we'll make sure that they listen to your speech." I thought, what audacity. But there they are. It was remarkable. Can I just say 2 facts? My head is occasionally full of facts which I don't know how to use, but they impress me. I'll just give you 2 facts that are tumbling around my head. The other day, I looked up statistics and I found, to my astonishment, that in 2 years ago, the child born in Aboriginal Australia had a life expectancy higher than the average child born in Russia. What an interesting commentary, a fact we never hear, but what a remarkable achievement, even if there is so much to go. And the other fact I sometimes have in my head, while so many promises are being made as the election draws closer, somebody has to produce the wealth to make those promises worthwhile. And 2 years ago, once a week, I used to look up the imports of grain in China. There was a drought in northern China, and there was a lot of suffering. But China was a great importer of grain, and I looked up, and week after week, the greatest seller of grain to China, far ahead of Ukraine and all other grain producers, was Australia. Month after month, it went on. And it's a remarkable achievement, isn't it? This country, which could feed barely 1 million people at one time, probably feeds in a good year about 100 million people in the world, 27 million in Australia, and the rest outside Australia. What a remarkable achievement. And I think at the moment, Western Australia is the head, am I right, of grain output in a typical year. We were having a discussion at the boardroom for 10 or so minutes before we came into this hall. Could I just carry on the discussion? A question I'm often asked. I wrote in 1973 a book, The Causes of War, and I've always been interested in the causes of war, and I'm now updating it. And people keep on asking the question that's so difficult to answer: will there be another world war? The news in Ukraine and the news in the Middle East is often disturbing, and quite understandably, so many people, not only in Australia, but in most countries of the world, wonder if this is a precursor to a third world war. I'm inclined to think it is not, but one can't be sure. World wars, devastating as they are rare events. And strictly speaking, the Second World War should not have happened. Germany was defeated in 1918, and Germany was disarmed, but the World Depression came, and people, memory altered, and suddenly Germany was allowed to rearm. Germany was allowed to rearm, and under Hitler, it rearmed with enormous speed, and he began one by one to capture countries before he began in 1939, the Second World War. I'm inclined to think, looking back at the period between 1945 and 1990, the end of the Second World War and the end of the Cold War, that we had two international crises that possibly were similar to the crisis which at present envelops parts of the world. The first event was the Cuban Missile Crisis, when President Kennedy, and not long before his death, was ruling over the United States. And without the United States really noticing it, Russia began to land in Cuba, so close to the American mainland. Soldiers in enormous numbers, and the evidence suggests that 45,000 Russian soldiers were hidden in Cuba before the United States fully realized what was happening. With missiles, New York could have been hit from Cuba, and certainly the cities in the far south could have been badly damaged. That crisis was eventually solved, but the world shuddered for 2 or 3 months at that time. The second crisis, which is illuminating, took place in the mid-1980s. Ronald Reagan was the president of the United States and was spending heavily on armaments as the period of the Star Wars. And the Soviet Union was spending on armaments twice as much of its annual wealth as was the United States, but Russia was quite unable to match the armaments that were being produced in the United States. And so there came that dangerous moment when Russia, having invaded Afghanistan, and after 9 years found itself defeated by that country with such a tiny population. And there was a great fear that Afghanistan might, as a last resort, use atomic weapons or hydrogen bombs. In fact, it didn't happen. I think of those events, and they have some similarity, we can't know, to the situation facing us today. We just can't be sure. We're a small nation, Australia, in terms of population, a huge landmass, but a small population. Our history tells us something very simple. We, whether we like it or not, must have an ally. If we're going to have an ally, we have to pull our weight, and at the moment, Australia's defences are not very strong. In fact, Kim Beazley, a West Australian, who was the Minister for Defence and a very successful minister under the Hawke government in the 1980s, he said quite recently that Australia's defences are in an unenviable position, and I respect his remarks. The fact is, we have to have an ally. We have had a long record of successful alliances, and for more than a century, our ally was Great Britain. And whenever there was a crisis, we either looked to Great Britain for help, or we helped Great Britain. And in the First World War, Australia gave an enormous help, and we lost 60,000 soldiers and a couple of 100,000 more who were wounded by war, some of them wounded permanently, but we pulled our weight. We pulled our weight in the Second World War, but not to the same extent. But we have to have an ally. We forget, and it's important that we remember it, that when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, one of the most successful attacks in the history of the world, caught Pearl Harbor, Honolulu, completely by surprise, did enormous damage to the American fleet, but fortunately the aircraft carriers weren't there. But Japan, having carried out that surprise victory with remarkable success, on the same day landed troops in Thailand and began to invade British Malaya. Britain thought that what Japan did was impossible, but a few weeks before Japan made the attack, Winston Churchill was persuaded that he must send 2 large warships to Singapore, the main British naval base in that area, and to defend it if necessary. There was great excitement in Singapore when the Prince of Wales and the Repulse arrived, but they'd only been there a few days when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and invaded Malaysia. And the Prince of Wales and the Repulse went north to investigate. But by then, Japan not only had command of the sea, but command of the air, and dive bombers flew overhead the Prince of Wales and the Repulse and sank them with great speed. There was heavy loss of life, but the Navy that was supposed to defend Singapore was no more. Australia then, remarkably, was building its own military aircraft. Japan had the Zero, a remarkable invention, which Air Force authorities thought Japan couldn't possibly make. They thought Japan had no technical skills, but Japan had built these Zeros with great success. When the first one was shot down, the engine was sent to England for examination, and they said there can only be one such plane, and it must have been bought from the United States. They didn't realise that the Zero was being made on a large scale in Japan and was superior to any British aeroplane in the West Pacific. It must have been terrible to be the Australian forces in that area. The Australians and the Indians and the British Army fought the Japanese in Malaya, but the Japanese moved south with lightning speed, and in no time they were on the point of crossing into Singapore. And Singapore fell on the 15th of February 1942. Churchill, who was then the Prime Minister of Great Britain and tremendously interested in military affairs, Churchill believed it was impossible for Pearl Harbor to fall, and he believed it was impossible for Singapore to fall. And there came this message to London that the armies in Singapore had surrendered, and Churchill was absolutely flabbergasted. And he sent a message to President Roosevelt, then our ally, saying, "I can't tell you how terrible this news is. It's the worst disaster in British military history. And the worst was to come. Japan sent its troops everywhere. In no time, they captured Hong Kong, defended by the Canadians. They invaded Burma, a great oil producer, and captured it in no time. They invaded the Dutch East Indies, another great oil producer, and occupied it. Even before Singapore fell, the Japanese had captured Rabaul near the equator in British-controlled New Guinea. It was a remarkable series of captures, and it shows how remarkable the Japanese did in 2.5 months, that 3 years later, most of these countries were still occupied by the Japanese. Hence, the atomic bomb had to be dropped to end the war. 4 days after the fall of Singapore, Darwin was bombed. It was our main fortified place on the whole northern coast of Australia, and in Darwin were more warships, Australian, American, than had ever assembled into northern Australian harbour. Darwin was bombed by aircraft coming from the same Japanese aircraft carriers which had done the great damage in Pearl Harbor. It was a great shock to Darwin, and Darwin, I think, was bombed another 60 times. I remember I was chairman of a government committee, and the committee went to Darwin for a celebratory event to celebrate what Darwin thought was the important day in its history. And they said that was the important day in their history, the day when we were bombed and completely taken by surprise. And on the platform, a man gave the address. He said, I was a young clergyman. I just arrived in Darwin and the city was bombed. And I was astonished that evening when the naval and military leaders came to him and said, we need your help. You must conduct a religious service. And all the civilian and military people who had been killed, there was no refrigeration. And they had to bury them in shallow water overnight so that the bodies would be preserved. And he said, I can never forget how humble I was, how shocked I was that I should be presiding over such an event. And so it went on and on. Remarkably, the war began to turn when the battle of the Coral Sea took place. A group of Japanese aircraft carriers came down from Rabaul, came to the east of New Guinea, and their plan was to land troops near Port Moresby, capture Torres Strait, and begin a powerful invasion of Port Moresby and the country behind. There took place the Battle of the Coral Sea. The ships on either side didn't see each other. The aeroplanes fought the whole battle. Japan really won, but they realised their victory wasn't big enough and they retreated back to Rabaul. And then came that remarkable event north of the equator on Midway Island, I think in August 1942, when Japan, which then still had more aircraft carriers than any other country in the world, began to fight an American fleet. And remarkably, the Americans had found out the Japanese naval code, and they knew everything Japan was going to do with its fleet. And Japan was taken by surprise, and all but one of its aircraft carriers were sunk. The code, incidentally, was broken partly by Captain Nave, a Melbourne man who came and studied in Western Australia for some time and learned colloquial Japanese. He was prominent in breaking the Japanese codes. So we have to think of events like that. One of the sad things of our history is we sometimes get it completely wrong. Mr. Menzies was the Prime Minister of Australia, Liberal from 1939 to 1941. 2 months before Pearl Harbor, Mr. Curtin, a Western Australian by adoption, married here. Mr. Curtin became the Prime Minister, and Mr. Curtin, when it came Christmas Day, 1941, decided he would write an article, and he sent it to the Murdoch papers, the Melbourne Herald. They didn't quite realise how important it was. He said, on behalf of Australia, I call on the United States to be our help rather than Britain in the crisis we face. We like to think, and we're often told, that Mr. Curtin's message was heeded. We invited the United States to defend us, and they came. It's not true. We didn't have that power. The Japanese, the United States had already arrived with their help before Mr. Curtin wrote that letter. On the 18th of December, I think 9 days before Mr. Curtin wrote that plea for help, a United States small fleet arrived in Brisbane and began to unload its cargo. We didn't bring the United States here. We didn't say, please help us. And they came. They came because sensibly they realised they needed a forward base, a launching pad from which eventually they can begin to recapture all the islands taken over by the Japanese. It's so important that we remember our history accurately. We didn't have the power. We didn't have the power to bring the United States here. They came here sensibly to suit, quite rightly, their own interests and ours. I think we should remember these important events. We should realise that we can, in a crisis, ask for help from our greatest ally, at present the United States, but it might not be able to help us at the time when the help is needed. A nation needs to be able to defend itself if it's impossible to get help from an ally at the time it's needed. Incidentally, people either hate or love Mr. Trump, and if you're an American, the feelings are so strong, the countries are so divided. But this has to be said about Mr. Trump, that in his first presidency, despite all the statements he made, he was very successful in military affairs. He entered no new war for America, and he went some distance towards bringing peace to the Middle East. But more important, towards the end, he said, China is the great problem, and we are going to stand up to China if anything happens. I think that we shouldn't be too hard on the strange statements he's been making. One remarkable thing has happened which people thought was impossible the day he entered the White House this year. They thought it was impossible that Europe would pull its own weight in defending itself. And here, almost miraculously, it looks as though France and Germany and Britain and the main European countries will decide for the first time in 3/4 of a century, they will try to pull their weight in defending themselves against Russia, or if necessary, against China. It looks as though this will happen, and we forget that despite all the strange words that come from him, this, if it happens, and it looks likely, this will be an astonishing achievement. Could I just conclude by saying, by the way, I think Taiwan is the danger place. Taiwan is the danger place. The Chinese Premier has promised many times that he would put the recapture of Taiwan, as he calls it, as his first priority, and the amount of military activity that's taking place around Taiwan is on a very substantial scale. It may be that China surrounds Taiwan and eventually pushes it into starvation and then into surrender. It may be it will conduct a direct invasion of Taiwan, and difficult as sea invasions are, have an ultimate victory. I'm not pessimistic, but one should be sensible and see this as a danger that faces Australia. I must conclude with a word about democracy. A speech was recently given by a distinguished British historian, Neil Ferguson. The speech was given to one of the Menzies Institutes in Melbourne. I didn't go, but it was reported in full. And he said that of people in the world who live in a democracy, of the people of the world who live in a true democracy, they are only 15% of the world's people. Australia supplies part of that 15%. There are many countries that are half democracies and quarter democracies, but there are big numbers of countries, China included, that are autocracies. India, remarkably, is still a democracy, although some would say it has some difficulties. I think we should be proud that we are democracies. We're one of the oldest continuous democracies in the world. Most of the old democracies in Europe were overrun by Hitler and ceased to be democracies. It's incredible that this young country should be one of the oldest continuous democracies in the world. And it's remarkable the achievements this democracy has to its credit. We were the first, or South Australia was the first place in the world not only to give women the vote, but women the right to stand for Parliament. New Zealand was the first to give women the vote, but for a long time they were not allowed to stand for Parliament. South Australia was remarkable in many ways in its belief in democracy. In 1896, there was an election in South Australia where women, for the first time, had the right to vote, and the Aboriginals also had the right to vote, as long as they did not live in the Northern Territory, where most of the Aboriginals were still living their traditional life and were not part of our political society. But their Aboriginal women in South Australia voted in large numbers. I've done some research on this. Unfortunately, South Australia does not realise this distinction to its name. I've looked up the 9 biggest cities in the world in that year when the South Australian women and the Aboriginal women had the vote if they wished it. And I can find no big city in the world at that time that gave women the vote. So there have been remarkable experiments in Australia. You may say democracy is not doing as well as it should in Australia at present, and there's some justification for saying so, but we're to blame as much as the politicians. We elect or dismiss the politicians. A democracy, in my view, can only succeed if maybe 15% of or 20% of the population personally accept responsibilities for the well-being of the nation. You have to have a sizable stratum of people in a true democracy for the democracy to work. We have to accept that responsibility. I've gone over my time. I do apologise. I must still be on Victorian time. Do we have any questions, or should I sit down? No, we've got no rovings with that. Thank you very much.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Stephen Schwartz, and I've been given the privilege of offering a vote of thanks to Professor Blainey for his talk. But I have to say, this is something of a daunting task for me. Because Professor Blainey, as you know, is Australia's most famous and most respected historian. How do I follow that? One thing you've noticed in his talk is he's curious about lots of different things. And you've heard some of them tonight, but not all of them. He's curious about railways. He's curious about goldfields. He's curious about war, as you know. His book titles have become idioms in our Australian lexicon. Tyranny of distance. This is something difficult to follow with a vote of thanks, because in each and every one of the areas in which Professor Blainey has worked, he's shown three characteristics. We call them three C's. The first is curiosity, which I've just mentioned. The second is courage, courage to say what he really thinks based on his research, with fear of nothing. And he's also, the third C, clarity. He's always clear, and he's always easy and to follow the road of thinking from facts to conclusions when Professor Blainey is talking. And I think tonight you would agree you saw all of those qualities on display. My takeaway message from this evening's speech is that all countries face challenges, sometimes terrible ones, like in 1942, and we need to study that history, both good and bad, successes, failures, triumphs and defeats, if we're going to learn the lessons of those times, and if we're going to apply those lessons to modern challenges so that Australia can continue not only to survive, but to thrive and reach even higher levels of freedom and fairness than it already has. Some of those were pointed out there. So we thank you, Professor Blainey. We thank you for your speech. We thank you for your enduring contribution to our Australian culture. I'd also like to take this opportunity, as long as I'm standing here, to also thank the Mannkal Foundation. The Mannkal Foundation, of which I think I was one of the first board members many, many years ago, has supported education and it also supports the scholars who are celebrating here tonight. And surely that deserves our deepest thanks. So on behalf of everyone here, Professor Blainey, thank you for your address. And thank you, Mannkal. Thank you and everyone involved with Mannkal for helping not just to support the scholars who are here, but to support Australia's future. So now please join me in giving our vote of thanks to both the Speaker and Mannkal.
Good evening, everyone. I firstly want to let you know that I'm really honoured to say that from next week I'm formally joining the Mannkal Foundation and the IPA. And having had both personal experience with Mannkal through my identical twin sons, who were part of Mannkal for a number of years, and also through my work in mining, I had a lot of contact with Mannkal too. I want to ask you, where in the world would our young people get opportunities like these? I've been looking at this year's program of opportunities, and I am completely blown away, not only by that, but by the calibre of young people in the room tonight that I've already had the opportunity to talk to. Some of them I've known before, others I've just met, but I'm genuinely excited to see what all of these young people are going to do with the wonderful opportunities being presented to them. So thank you to the founder. I think this is unique and it's an incredible opportunity. My first duty tonight that I'm really proud of is to congratulate the 2024 graduates, scholars, who have had some absolutely amazing experiences and some wonderful results. And I'd like them to come up one at a time. I'm ably assisted by Nathan and Larissa, who both are from the Mannkal office and doing an outstanding job. And I'd like you to stand on the stage afterwards. The first person is Ari Barbutas. Sheldon Brown. Louis Comer. And Louis is also picking up Sid Morales' certificate. Thank you. Matthias Evans. Zoe Griffiths and her father Andrew will collect her certificate for her. Ruben Kaiser. Jamie Lowe. Hannah Waldron. If you'd like to remain on stage, congratulations. On top of this, my first duty as a volunteer was to work with the team and with some of you present tonight to select 8 people who are going to attend the Centre for Independent Studies, Liberty and Society conference beginning on the 11th of April. Another amazing opportunity. And the last congratulations I have is to Sheldon Brown, who's the 2025-26 Mannkal Scholarship recipient for research at the University of Notre Dame. His thesis will be on the history of economic thought and monetary theory. So congratulations to all the students. I'd like to now invite founder Ron Manners to present the prestigious annual John Hyde Scholar Award.
This is a surprise. Nobody knows who it is. However, let me explain a little bit about John Hyde, who the award's named after. And John is pretty well known to a lot of you. He was a successful farmer who went on to become a federal member of Parliament for some years. And he went on, and he started a think tank in Perth called the AIPP, which was ultimately taken over by IPA because they wanted John to go to Melbourne and become the executive director of the IPA. Then John was a founding director of Mannkal for many years, until recently. And he proved to me that one person can make a difference. He was the single person from beginning to end that devised the economic policies that revolutionised Australia in the late 80s through to the early 90s. He assembled a group around him called the DRIES, D-R-I-E-S, it's Dry Economic Policy, Deregulation and Freeing up the Economy. an amazing achievement. He assembled all the policies that were required. He could not get his Prime Minister, Malcolm Fraser, the least bit interested in any of these policies. Fraser saw no benefit of pursuing that. He saw no votes in it. And ironically, it was left to the Hawke and Keating government that followed Malcolm Fraser. And a long story, but Bob Hawke heard John Hyde's presentation about these policies because his own people were not expecting to win. The ALP were not expecting to win the election. When they got in, Bob Hawke gathered his people around and said, "Has anyone got any policies?" They said, the only guy we know that talks about policies is John Hyde from the other side." Hawke said, "Bring him in." And John Hyde gave a presentation, encouraged by Peter Walsh, the ALP Finance Minister. And Bob Hawke sent John Hyde out of the room and said, "Anyone got any better ideas?" Nobody spoke up, and Bob Hawke said, "We'll do the bloody lot." And that's exactly what he did. I know I was fortunate enough to be in business through those amazing years when we saw Australia, which was stagnant, like a ship becalmed with no wind. Suddenly the wind came up, and the wind in our sails, we were travelling at full speed. That was a wonderful about 8 years. It's tapering off. There's no, as you can see, there's no thirst for policies on either side of Parliament at the moment, and we're poorer for that case. So that's why we've named an award, the John Hyde Award. Now, it gives me great pleasure to announce the winner of the 93 for John Hyde Award is Ruben Kaiser. A fine fellow, you'll listen. Perhaps somebody might take a photo of this. Here we go, we'll have a photo. Happy with this? Okay. Okay. Now also there's a remarkable book, but I do know the secret of this book. It's a book about the history of Australia, signed by a very famous author called Professor Geoffrey Blainey. That's all right. I'm going to spring this one on Ruben. I've just told you about how John Hyde, one person concentrating on economic reforms, made such a difference. Now, Ruben, let me ask you, if you have this opportunity to create a better Australia, how would you go about it?
Talk about putting you on the spot. But I think if I learned anything from Mannkal, if one thing really stuck in my mind, I had the amazing opportunity of going to Vermont and reading up about Milton Friedman, the Nobel Prize winning economist, and I think that line that stuck in my head was, I've never yet heard anybody defend a government policy who said that all its evils came from the fact that it was not big enough. So I think in that spirit and the spirit of John Hyde, I think that's the path Australia should take. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
We have still one remaining award, and this is the annual Neve Loader Award. She was one of our great scholars, and she's no longer with us, and that has inspired us to be able to deliver an annual award in her memory. And I thank Malcolm and Tina for attending. So the winner this year is Ari Barbudas for his excellent works into how we engage our scholars and our future scholars. Now, the evening wouldn't be complete without acknowledging a key part of our team and a main structural support, I think is an appropriate word, for our scholarship program under the new Enterprise Hub, and that's Siri, our entrepreneurial team, and they provide us with multiple levels of support, not the least of which is their excellent programs and their seminars that our students attend. They also help us with thoughts and ideas because we think they matter. All right, without any further ado, please mingle and enjoy some refreshments.